Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and today we'll be discussing in Honors Economics, the first unit, the introduction material to economics. What is economics, and how does it study the choices that we make, particularly in the fact that resources are scarce, and so we always have trade-offs or alternatives that we have to give up, also known as costs. So this presentation will cover that introductory material. So first we'll look at what is economics and why is it important. As a science in particular, it studies the choices that we have. Micro and macroeconomics, the difference between the study of smaller individual choices and those of a society as a whole. How economists use theories and models to understand economic issues because they take human complexity and try to boil it down to simplistic models. And how to organize economies, an overview of economic systems, because each society has to decide how they answer basic economic questions, and the way in which they do that determines how we categorize them. So economics is the study of how humans make decisions in the face of scarcity. These can be individual decisions, family decisions, business decisions, or societal decisions. And scarcity is important because it means the human wants for goods and services and resources exceed what is available. We have a limited amount of resources, including one of the most important resources, which would be time. And because of this, we have to choose. We have to choose between which way to go, left or right, up or down, this job or that job, this particular school or a different one. Every day we have to make choices smaller and bigger, and when we do that, of course, we have to give up some type of alternative that we could have had instead. So economics studies those choices that we have to make because resources are finite. And one of the important things about economics, of course, is the data that they look through in order to measure those choices that happen. For instance, the Fred website includes data of nearly 400,000 domestic and international economic social variables over time. And we look at a lot of these in economics. It includes things like inflation, unemployment, poverty, and so on. So it includes an incredible amount of data. And that's the thing, is economics is a social science, but it's still numbers driven. Economics is greatly impacted by how well information travels through society. And of course, today, social media helps information travel as much as possible. But of course, one of the challenges is that economics can be misinterpreted. People can be scared fairly easily into altering their choices without any evidence that they need to. And this is further emphasized by social media. People can be scared pretty easily, although on the other hand, they can also have better access to information to find out the truth. But the question is, are they willing to do that? Scarcity. And so the question is, what are examples of critical goods and services? Well, those are obviously the basic necessities: shelter, food, and clothing. And the scarcity of those in particular can be a major driving force in society. Homeless people, as it shows here in the picture, are a stark reminder that scarcity of resources is real. And one of the things to remember, and this is a criticism of capitalism by some, is that there are plenty of resources, but often they're not distributed that well. And that's because in a market society, we'll talk more about this a little bit later, in a market society, one of the questions that we have to answer in any society, but in a market society, we answer in a particular fashion. The question is, who gets the goods and services? And the answer is whoever can afford them. And because of that, the distribution of goods does not have equity in a market-based system or capitalism. And so because of that, we end up with people, basically because the resources are scarce due to price, that are not able to get those particular resources. And so the question is, we'll talk about later on, a government perspective, should society try to remedy those situations and increase equity? But the overall study of economics we can trace back to a time before you could actually get a degree in economics, when it was more part of philosophy during the Enlightenment period and the immediate years afterwards. For instance, Adam Smith introduced the idea of dividing labor into discrete tasks in his famous 1776 book titled The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations really gave an overview of some of the broader and more significant points of a free market society and why it works efficiently. Some of these ideas include self-incentive, the fact that people are motivated to look out for themselves, so they'll compete with one another. People will compete for jobs. People will compete with other businesses to sell the best products, and that makes us all better. And that's a major hallmark of Adam Smith's idea in the capitalist system. The division of labor is the way in which different workers provide required tasks to produce a good or service. So each of us finds our niche, our specialization that we can concentrate on, that we have at least an absolute advantage on. That way we try to do as best as we can, better than anybody else. And that helps motivate us, for instance, to work as much as possible. Now, in Adam Smith's time, this picture up here is obviously modern day. It's a picture of an assembly line. But in Adam Smith's time, a lot of work was individualized. And so it paid for someone to concentrate on being a blacksmith because they could become better and better and better at it and provide a better service to everyone else while also making money for themselves. As we've gotten to the modern day, this kind of changed things into the fact that people often work routine jobs that anybody can do, anybody can plugged into that has the proper training. So it's kind of altered this a little bit, but still each of those workstations in this assembly line concentrates on a specific task that they're going to be performing. Dividing and subdividing the tasks involved with producing a good or services produces a greater quantity of output. It doesn't make sense on an assembly line for you to move along with a product and do a different job each time at each station. That is going to end up sucking up a lot of time, and people aren't going to get as good at each individual task. And so specialization is when workers or firms focus on particular tasks which they are well suited within the overall production process. It increases efficiency. It takes less time to get things done and makes people better at their jobs. Specialization allows businesses to take advantage of economies of scale, which means that for many goods, as the level of production increases, the average cost of producing each individual unit declines. Because if you have everybody specializing, you can then increase production. And if you're increasing production, all of the ingredients or materials that you need in order to produce that good, you can now buy in bulk or greater quantity, and you can get better deals on. So that helps bring down the cost overall of production. And so that's the economies of scale. The bigger you go, the more cost effective it can be. Economics is concerned with the well-being of all people, including those with jobs and those without jobs, as well as those with high incomes and those with low incomes. So it encompasses everybody and all the types of decisions that can be made. Microeconomics focuses on the actions of individual agents within the economy, like households, workers, and businesses. Often we refer to businesses as firms, and then all the individual people, like workers, are put into the category of households. The households control, to some extent, a large amount of the land resources, but also, most importantly, labor. Businesses can also control land. Obviously, today corporations can buy and sell land and make contracts, for instance, with others. So in a way, those two kind of overlap a little bit, but businesses are the ones that sell the goods and services. And both of these sides, the households and the businesses, exchange these two things. The households are providing factors of production like labor. The businesses are providing the goods and services, and they exchange these things in the marketplace, obviously with the interactory variable of currency. Macroeconomics is the branch of economics that focuses on the broad issues such as growth, unemployment, inflation, trade, balance. So it concentrates on the overall society, its wealth, its problems. The measuring statistics go along with that. For instance, the most popular statistic or measurement used to calculate the overall status of an economy is the gross domestic product, which we'll talk throughout the course. Monetary policy is something that will come up as opposed to fiscal policy. These two are related, but they're also incredibly different. Monetary policy involves altering the level of interest rates, the availability of credit in the economy, and the extent of borrowing, and all this influences the supply of money. This is mostly operated in the United States by the Federal Reserve, our nation's central banking system. Now, other countries, the central bank is 100% part of the government, and at one point in time, early in the Republic, it was like this in the United States. But today it's operated by the Federal Reserve, which does have congressional authorization, and the board is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. But otherwise, though, most of this entity is made up of nationally chartered private banks. So most of it operates in the private sector, but it has policy implications for the entire country. Fiscal policy are economic policies that involve government spending and taxes. They're determined by a nation's legislative body. So the budget, when it's passed, a massive amount of spending and taxation that incurs, which is in the trillions of dollars, is fiscal policy, which can also have obviously a broad impact on our economy, not just in the United States, but the world, since the United States government is the world's largest consumer. And then there's, of course, how economists use theories and models to understand economic issues. One of the most influential economists in modern times was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes thought that economics teaches you how to think, not what to think. So it helps us become more rational human beings. And of course, Keynes would be incredibly influential. He would write a book during the Great Depression about how government should respond during economic contractions, and his policies have been widely followed ever since. A theory is a simplified representation of how two or more variables interact with each other. A good theory is simple enough to understand while complex enough to capture the key features of the object or situation you are studying. Economists use models to test theories, but for this course, we will use the term model and theory interchangeably. And this is an example of one of the models, the circular flow diagram, and it talks about one of the concepts I mentioned just a little bit ago. You have households, which includes individual people, and then you have firms, which are businesses. The firms, as I mentioned earlier, they produce goods and services, which they sell to households. And then, in turn, the households gives payments to the firms itself. Now, the households also transfer factors of production like labor. They sell their labor, their work to firms. They work for them as employees. And then the firms turn over wages, salaries, and benefits. And so you can see this makes a circular flow, which is why it's called a circular flow diagram. It shows how households and firms interact in the goods and services market and in the labor market. The direction of the arrow shows that the goods and services market, households receive goods and services and pay the firms for them, while in the labor market, households provide labor and receive payment from firms through wages, salaries, and benefits. Now, this is obviously a simplistic model. It involves a complex idea. This is how everything flows through the economy. But obviously, there's some caveats that are not included. For instance, there's government, which you can put in the center here, which takes taxes from both and provides services to both. And then there's also firms that buy from other firms. And there's households that buy from other households. They aren't necessarily set up as a business. And then there are things that are given without actual payment and received without actual payment. So there's lots of complexities that happen in the economy that don't fit nicely into this simple diagram. There are at least three ways that societies organize an economy. A traditional economy is typically an agricultural economy where things are done the same as they've always been done. It's considered the oldest economic system and is still used in some parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. Occupations tend to stay in a family, and most of them, once again, are going to be agrarian-based. And what you produce is what you consume. Because at this point in time, it's rare for people to have a surplus. And so they're basically just going to produce their necessities. Little economic progress or development occurs because there's a lack of those surpluses. People are making enough to get by, and they just concentrate on that. They're worried about shelter, clothing, and food, and clean water. So that's going to take up all their time, and so no one really thinks about beyond that. And certainly without surpluses, you can't have profit. Without profit, you can't expand. You can't acquire more resources, and so things are going to stay pretty much at the same level. A command economy is an economy where economic decisions are passed down from government authority or a central planning agency and where the government owns the resources. Often this is referred to as socialism, and socialism does advocate that society, hence socialism, takes over the means of production, the resources, the businesses, and so on, and they will technically make the decisions and employ people, and they will pay people more fairly, and they will make sure everyone is getting better pay for their work. Because why socialists get into power through violent revolution or elections is because they convince people, the working class people, that they're doing all this work and not getting enough out of it. And so they try to equalize that in a sense. So the government decides what goods and services will be produced and what prices it will charge for them. The government decides what methods of production to use and sets wages for workers. The government provides many necessities like healthcare, education for free. We say free, but the cost is, of course, is that they own everything and make all the decisions. Let me just point out, a national socialism, like what the Nazis were part of, They use the word socialism in their title to try to convince more working class people to support them, but their enemies were the actual socialists. Socialists and communists are on the left side of the political spectrum. National socialists or Nazis are on the right side of the political spectrum. Adolf Hitler was no enemy of capitalism. He helped a lot of corporations make a lot of money on selling military goods and other types of objects. And the Nazi Party members themselves, of course, enriched each other by buying products, for example, and handing them out as political tributes to the people. So they were no enemies of capitalism. Examples of command economy would be ancient Egypt, medieval manor life, communism, and we use this phrase because that's what socialists usually ended up calling themselves. And currently, of course, two of the world's most command-oriented economies, Cuba and North Korea. Then there are market systems. A market economy is one where economic decisions are decentralized. Private individuals own resources, and businesses supply goods and services based on demand. Interaction between potential buyers and sellers, a combination of demand and supply, is known as the marketplace. Private enterprise is a system where private individuals or groups of private individuals own and operate the means of production, like resources and businesses. Private enterprise can also be represented by free enterprise. That's an interchangeable phrase. Market, free market, capitalism. There are some slight distinctions, but those are often used interchangeably. And the New York Stock Exchange is a great example of that, because that is where buying and selling goes on at a constant basis. The products are unique. They are each one share of ownership in a company. The cost is based on how many people are willing to sell and how many people are willing to buy. If there's a lot more people willing to buy, it's going to drive the price up. If there's a lot more people willing to sell, it's going to drive the price down. It operates on pure supply and demand market-based decision-making. Most economies in the real world are mixed, though. They combine elements of command, traditional, and market systems. For instance, the command economy, it is virtually impossible for a government to make all the decisions. Even in North Korea, there's a black market where things are traded outside the government view. Same thing in Cuba, in the old Soviet Union. Not all decisions can be made by the government. It's just infeasible. It's impossible for them to control 100% of everything. So there's no such thing as a perfectly command economy. And once you start passing any laws at all, you limit people's economic freedom. If you pass laws against murder, someone who might want, for instance, to be hired out to carry out killings no longer has that ability. So even the smallest laws are eventually going to infringe upon economic decision making. And so there's no such thing as a completely 100% free market. The U.S. economy is positioned toward the free market end of the spectrum. Many countries in Europe and Latin America, while primarily market-oriented, have a greater degree of government involvement in economic decisions than the U.S. economy. China and Russia, while they have moved more in the direction of having a market-oriented economy, remain closer to the command end of the spectrum. So the U.S., if you put free market over here on the left side, it is more toward this side. Europe and Canada is right around here. Russia's here. China's here. And way over here on the right-hand side toward the command end would be North Korea. There's no such thing as an absolutely free market. Regulations always define the rules of the game in the economy. Economies are primarily market-oriented, have fewer regulations, ideally just enough to maintain an even playing field for participants. And of course, one thing I leave out here is to protect people's rights. Heavily regulated economies often have an underground economy or black market, which are markets where the buyers and sellers make transactions without government approval. And some things to remember is that markets are going beyond countries. They're also expanding globally. And globalization is the trend in which buying and selling in markets have increased across national borders. And this has been going on since the colonization era that helped found America. We were supplying resources, and England in turn was supplying us with manufactured goods. Exports, the goods and services that a nation produces domestically and sells abroad. Every country wants to be able to sell exports. Imports are the goods and services that are produced abroad and then sold domestically. Every country wants to limit imports, because if you are buying things from another country, it means that your businesses and your people aren't producing them. Gross domestic product is the measure of the size of the total production in an economy. So you can see cargo ships of the modern day. What are examples of products and services in the modern economy? How has this contributed to globalization? Well, many products include at least some parts or ingredients that require resources that are made elsewhere or are required in their production process to use lots of human labor, which is cheaper elsewhere. And so because of that, many products, at least some parts of them or components of them or something that influences them, are part of a global economy. The second part of this goes over the choice in a world of scarcity, and we'll talk about how individuals make choices based on the budget constraint, the production possibilities frontier, and social choices, and confronting objections to the economic approach. In general, the higher the degree, the higher the salary. This is a common thought today. So why aren't more people pursuing higher degrees? And the short answer is choices and trade-offs. People don't want to give up the time. People don't want to give up all the money. People don't want to give up their freedom, in particular if they don't like necessarily an academic setting. And so those are some of the reasons why people wouldn't consume that. And then on top of that, even if everyone did, that would dramatically increase the supply of people with higher degrees, which would cause wages to fall if too many people went into it in the first place, because there would be a surplus and unneeded labor. Budget constraint, all possible consumption combinations of goods that someone can afford, given the prices of goods, when all income is spent, the boundary of the opportunity set. The opportunity set is all possible combinations of consumption that someone can afford given the prices of goods and the individual's income. All income does not need to be spent. Given the price of the two goods and a budget amount, a budget constraint can be illustrated graphically. With a limited amount of income to spend on these things, consumers must choose what they need and want. Here we can see Alfonso's consumption choice budget, and he can either spend money on two things. Once again, models boil it down to something very simple, two variables at least. And so here we can see burgers, and this would be bus tickets. He has a budget of $10. So he only has $10. So if burgers are $2, he can purchase 5. 5 times $2 is 10. So we can see the amount of burgers, the maximum he can have. Of course, if he does buy all burgers, then he won't have any money to do anything else. Bus tickets are 50 cents. So he can buy, for some odd reason, 20 bus tickets. And if he did that, he's not going to have any money to spend on burgers. Or he can spend a combination of them. So each point on the budget constraint represents a combination of burgers and bus tickets whose total cost adds up to Alfonso's budget of $10. The slope of the budget constraint is determined by the relative price of burgers and bus tickets. Giving up one burger means gaining 4 bus tickets. So if he goes down to 4 burgers, 4 times 2 is 8. It means he has $2 left over. And $2 divided by 50 cents means that he can purchase 4 bus tickets. That's why it's the cost of that particular choice. Or giving up the burger, is a cost of that particular choice. The opportunity set, every point or inside the constraint, which shows a combination of burgers and bus tickets that Alfonso can afford. Any point outside the constraint is not affordable because it would cost more money than Alfonso has in his budget. So all this area out here is beyond his budget. Opportunity cost indicates that one must give up to obtain what he or she desires. The cost of one item is the lost opportunity to do or consume something else. The opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. A fundamental principle of economics is that every choice has an opportunity cost. For Alfonso, the opportunity cost of a burger is the 4 bus tickets he would have to give up. So once again, I've repeated this before, and I'll do it again. Economics is not just, when it talks about cost, the money, because he's going to be giving up the $10 or some amount of that $10 if he decides to purchase something on the inside of this. But the cost is not just that. If he decides to go with one less hamburger, that is the cost in order to purchase those 4 bus tickets. We assume for himself to ride 4 times, or himself and 3 friends. I don't know what other reason you would have to purchase 4 bus tickets, but nevertheless, the cost of those 4 bus tickets would be not just the money, but also the burger that he could have had otherwise. In many cases, it is reasonable to refer to the opportunity cost as the price. Example, if your cousin buys a new bicycle for $300, then $300 measures the amount of the other consumption you could have forsaken. So to simplify things, we often just look at the price. But the problem is, in order to think rationally, you also have to consider the other things that you've given up in order to do that. Sometimes the prices measured in dollars may not accurately capture the true opportunity cost, such as when costs of times are involved. Example, attending college. The out-of-pocket cost of attending college includes tuition, books, room and board, and other expenses. But additionally, during the hours you're attending class and studying, it is impossible to work at a paying job. So college imposes both an out-of-pocket cost and an opportunity cost of lost earnings. And plus, something else it doesn't mention, because you can still tabulate that monetarily by saying, look, I could have worked this many hours and I could have made this much money. But it's also more than that. Like, let's say you are someone that is not studious at all. You don't like book work, you don't like note-taking, you don't like writing. Then the cost for you is going to be emotional, but it is still going to be high. If you went to college, you are aggravating yourself, and so that is also an opportunity cost, because that aggravation wouldn't be happening if you were doing something else. And so some of those things cannot be easily measured with money. What are the opportunity costs of buying versus leasing a car? Investing in different ways. Going out to eat versus preparing food at home. Walking or taking public transportation. This one, the opportunity cost of public transportation is not just walking, but the exercise you would get from doing it, for instance. Investing in different ways. You can go to a broker and have them put together a portfolio for you, or you can go around and research and invest in each of these. So the opportunity cost of doing your own investments, of course, is all that time and effort and frustration that you might not have had. For instance, you would have had an easier time if you just gone to a broker. So there are ways that you could look at all of these and consider the different opportunity cost. Marginal analysis is examining the benefits and costs of choosing a little more or a little less of a good. So we look at things incrementally. How good, or what is the utility that we incur if we eat a second hamburger and a third hamburger? The fourth hamburger is not going to be as good as the first one. Utility, satisfaction, usefulness, or value one obtains from consuming goods and services. In law of diminishing marginal utility, as a person receives more of a good, the additional or marginal utility from each additional unit of the good declines. So the first slice of pizza is not going to be the first slice of pizza eaten brings more satisfaction than the six. Or, we talked about having vacation. The first day is relaxing and exhilarating, but then if it goes on for a month, even though people might be excited about getting a month vacation, obviously at the end of that, especially if you haven't been doing anything, is not going to be as rewarding psychologically as the first day. Sunk costs are costs that were incurred in the past and cannot be recovered. For people and firms alike, dealing with sunk costs can be frustrating. A firm finds it hard to give up on a new product that is doing poorly because much money was spent in creating and launching the product. The lesson of sunk costs is to ignore the past errors and make decisions based on what will happen in the future. So for people, sunk costs are a car that they bought or a house that they bought. Sure, they can get rid of these things, they can sell them, but obviously that's a little bit more complicated and can't be accomplished right away, as opposed to smaller objects or things that are less costly that you could get rid of more quickly. So sunk costs are kind of on a sliding scale. Some costs are more sunk than others. If you're setting up a business and you have to buy all kinds of expensive machinery that can't be resold, that is an example of an extremely sunk cost. Production possibilities frontier is one of the systems of models that we use, like the one that was pictured for individual people. And the production possibilities frontier, or PPF, is a diagram that shows the productively efficient combinations of two products that an economy can produce given the resources it has available. The slope of the production possibilities frontier shows the opportunity cost. So this is healthcare versus education. A society can spend its money on healthcare or it can spend its money on education. Let's say it's two departments within the cabinet, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education, and they both could be given a certain amount of money. And so this production possibilities frontier shows a trade-off between devoting social resources to healthcare and devoting them toward education. So if you are at point A, you're putting all of your money, let's say the budget is $1 billion, all of it is going to healthcare, and you have $0 for education. This is $0 in education. This is $1 billion toward healthcare. And the exact opposite is true. If you go to point F, $1 billion will go to education and $0 will go to healthcare, because this is 0 for healthcare, $1 billion for education. At D, most resources are going to education. So right here, and at B, most resources are going to healthcare. A society could choose to produce any combination of healthcare and education. So if it goes here, most of it's going to education. If it's here, most is going to healthcare. Right about here is going to be even. This is beyond it. They're not going to get any more money than $1 billion. So anywhere outside the curve is not possible. Because the PPF is downward sloping from left to right, the only way to society to obtain more education is by giving up some health care. And, opportunity cost, we could have some numbers on here. And let's say that this is $200 million. So in order to gain some education, you'd have to give up $200 million worth of health care in order to do that. And the opposite is true. Let's say this looks smaller. So let's say this is $100 million. So you would have to give up $100 million of education to gain some health care. Law of diminishing returns. As additional increments of resources to producing a good or service are added, the marginal benefit from those additional increments will decline. The law of diminishing marginal utility is a more specific case of the law of diminishing returns. The curvature of the PPF shows that as we add more resources to education, moving from left to right along the horizontal axis, the original gains are fairly large, but gradually diminish. By contrast, as we add more resources to healthcare, moving from bottom to top on the vertical axis, the original gains are fairly large, but again gradually diminish. Two major differences between a budget constraint, though, and a PPF, and I'm sure you noticed them graphically. The budget constraint is a straight line. Slope is given by the relative price of the two goods, which are fixed, so slope doesn't change. The PPF has a curve shape because of the law of diminishing returns, so slope is different at various points on the PPF. The absence of specific numbers on the axes of the PPF. The exact amount of resources an imaginary economy has is not known. But like I said, you could try to come up with those numbers, especially if it was a specific decision that someone was going to make. Similarities, budget constraint and the PPF. Both the budget constraint and the social production possibilities frontier show the constraints under which individual consumers and society as a whole operate. Both diagrams show the trade-off in choosing more of one good at the cost of less of the other. Productive efficiency is when it is possible to produce more of one good or service without decreasing the quantity produced of another good or service. Any choice inside the PPF is productively inefficient because it is possible to produce more of one good, the other good, or some combination of both goods. Allocative efficiency is when the mix of goods produced represents the mix that society most desires. So underutilizing resources or a lack of efficiency will occur inside the curve, and once again, outside the curve is impossible with the resources you have. So productive efficiency. All choices along a given PPF, like point B, C, and D, display productive efficiency. R does not, because it is inside the PPF curve, and thus not all resources are being used. And there you can see point R. So, how much of a good a country decides to produce depends on how expensive it is to produce versus buying it from a different country. Countries tend to have different opportunity costs of producing a specific good, either because of different climates, geography, technology, or skills, or other variables. A comparative advantage exists when a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. So, here we're seeing the production possibilities frontier and comparative advantage. The US PPF is flatter than the Brazil PPF, implying that the opportunity cost of wheat in terms of sugarcane is lower in the US than in Brazil. Conversely, the opportunity cost of sugarcane is lower in Brazil. The US has comparative advantage in wheat, and Brazil has a comparative advantage in sugarcane. Confronting objections to the economic approach. Objections in understanding the economic approach to decision-making. People, firms, and society do not act in a way that fits the economic way of thinking. Not everyone is always rational. Individuals, businesses, often operate on emotion and fear, or without knowing all the information. However, it is reasonable as a first approximation to analyze them with the tools of economic analysis. People, firms, and society should not act this way. The economics approach portrays people as self-interested, but economics is not a form of moral instruction. It seeks to describe economic behavior as it actually exists. Uses positive statements, which describe the world as is. These are factual. Then there are normative statements. This tries to avoid normative statements are those that describe how the world should be. And so some say that should be avoided. These statements are subjected to questions of opinion. So this positive statements describe how the world is, normative describes how the world should be, and often involves policy suggestions. So there's disagreement about what exact approach that people should take. The invisible hand is a concept that individual self-interested behavior can lead to positive social outcomes, and is identified in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Consumers will encourage businesses to offer goods and services that meet their needs. So they'll demand certain goods, and those are the ones that businesses will provide. If they provide goods that people don't want, then they'll go out of business. It is possible that the broader social good can emerge from selfish individual action. So everyone going through their own self-interest. I would like to get a job. I would like to get a promotion. I would like to get a pay raise. So I'm going to do a really good job. And that means I'll be able to serve the business or employer that I work for and the customers that I interact with. So self-interest helps make better overall actions for the social good. And self-interest in economics does not imply self-interest in all aspects of life.